So I'm Dennis Vogel. I'll be your moderator. I'm joining from Loring Smart Roast. We design and manufacture coffee roasting equipment. And more importantly, Rob Hoos is joining us. He is a specialty coffee consultant, SCA trainer, author, director of roasting at Nossa Familia in Portland. What did I forget, Rob? What else?
No, that's about it. I mean, father to three awesome
father.
kids and, husband to an amazing wife. So that's me in a nutshell.
All right. So for the agenda today, folks, as you probably expected from the invite, we're going to talk about roasting defects. You can advance this one, please, Rob.
You got it. Hey, there we are.
There we are.
We did this part already.
We did.
Well, there's both of us when we looked younger. So.
For sure. So as we talked about for the agenda, we're going to be diving down into what are roast defects, definitions, the different types of roast defects, because there's a few different categories and specific types. And then finally, what can you do to avoid roast defects, which I think is probably what we're all hoping to learn more about. And then, of course, we'll be doing live Q&A at the end. During the presentation, I will be monitoring the chat window. And so you're welcome to throw questions in there, and I'll do my best to catch ones that are relevant to that part of the presentation. And at the end, then we'll be opening up live Q&A, and I'll be picking questions that come along the way, as well as giving people the opportunity to raise their hand and ask some questions real time at the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rob.
Sweet. And I'm driving now, so let's get into this. What are roasting defects? And specifically, we're talking about coffee roasting defects, correct? So not like, if you're here for your pork ribs or something like that, I'm of no use to you. So basically, when we're talking about roasting defects, we're basically saying that something wrong happened during the roast. And the reason that wrong is in quotation marks is because we are going to be going over some roasting defects that are objective. They're measurable and they are something that is fairly apparent. And then there are others that are a little bit more subjective. And so as with most things in coffee, beauty is almost always in the eye of the beholder. It really just depends on what good means to you and how you define that. So that's kind of what we're going to be holding in our minds as we go throughout these. So something wrong happens during the roasting coffee. One of the ways in which coffee roasting defects can happen is you have a poor roasting approach. This means that the design of how you've chosen to roast the coffee, whether it be the roasting speed, heat application, the way you set up your roaster, fan speed, drum speed, all that sort of stuff, something has gone wrong in your roasting approach. Secondarily is heat transfer issues, where something has happened during the process of adding heat energy to the coffee that has caused some sort of issue with the coffee. And so as we're going from green to brown, how do we do that in such a way that we don't create defects that cause flavor issues or visual issues for our consumers and for ourselves? So it's going to be what we're focusing on. And the result that we've already kind of mentioned, subjective roasting defects and objective roasting defects. So a physical issue in terms of something you can actually see on the bean, and or a flavor issue. Some of them are physical only with no flavor issues that are kind of associated with them. Others are both a physical issue and a flavor issue, and some of them don't have any physical evidence and are only a flavor issue. So those are kind of the things that we're going to be breaking down today. As you can see, this is a very light roasted Kenyan coffee that's here, and we've zoomed in uncomfortably close to it. So if you're curious, that's what's going on there. Let's start with the ones that are a little bit more tricky to talk about because they are subjective. So let's dive into subjective roast defects. The first one is going to be under or overdeveloped. We've got a couple different examples here, and some of the things that I do want to highlight too is when we're talking about over and underdeveloped, specifically we're looking at coffees that have different lengths of development time, theoretically to the same end temperature or end color, although that isn't always the case. So let's kind of tease some of that apart here. So, and we'll talk about over and under roasted because that's a separate category. And there is a reason I want to make a distinction between the two, even though in specialty coffee, we almost always kind of merge and intermingle them. And that's because words are important. And so using the appropriate word for the appropriate issue actually helps communicate something. But what happens a lot in coffee, and anybody who's a home roaster probably feels this 1000%, or anybody who's been in roasting for a while, like when people used to say full city, it's like, okay, well, what the heck does full city roast even mean? Same thing with other nomenclature like Italian roast or French roast that goes around in the United States, or espresso roast. We've pushed in blurred lines in terms of what a lot of these actually mean. And so the words are fairly meaningless. They've kind of devolved into more marketing terminology. But when we start talking about roasting and we talk about the professional side of it, we have to be very careful that we're using the right words to describe the right problems so that we're actually communicating ideas clearly. So underdeveloped, baseline, and overdeveloped. So we'll assume that the baseline roast is a good roast. Underdeveloped means that the amount of time in development is less than it should be. Now that is necessarily incredibly wiggly. And the reason it's necessarily wiggly is because, once again, underdeveloped is kind of in the eye of the beholder. This is one of our subjective roasting defects. Now, theoretically, an underdeveloped coffee has the same end temperature or end color as a properly developed coffee, or what the baseline would be. The only difference is that the time from the beginning of first crack until the end of the roast is too short relative to what the desired flavor outcome is. Baseline, theoretically, the desired flavor outcome. And overdeveloped means that the development time is too long. So from the beginning of first crack until the end of the roast, the coffee has spent too long of a period of time for the flavor that you're hoping to develop in that coffee. Notice once again that all these are terminating at about the same end temperature because, I went too far. I've got one of those like really sensitive mice that just kind of goes whenever it wants to. So once again, color is the same, probably whole bean primarily, because ground color does change with development time. So whole bean color is the same, and temperature is the same, development time is the thing that's shifting around. Usually when someone describes an underdeveloped coffee, we'll use terms like metallic, vegetal, it could be overly acidic or harsh. And sometimes the harshness can be from acidity, sometimes the harshness is from sugar browning issues, but we'll get around to that here eventually. Overdeveloped, on the other hand, means that we spent too much time in development time. And as a result, a lot of the volatile aromatics or the volatile acids that we're trying to capture and enjoy aren't present any longer. They've been cooked out. So the coffee tastes a little bit more samey, a little less interesting. That would be kind of how we would classically define an overdeveloped coffee. The one quick note I do want to make is development time does play a role in terms of interior color of the coffee and how the heat transfer moves from the outside to the inside. Even with the same whole bean color or same end temperature, an underdeveloped coffee is probably going to have a lighter ground color reading. An overdeveloped coffee is going to have a darker ground color reading because the coffee is able to hold onto that heat for a little bit longer, and it goes through more chemical changes, which means it goes through more sugar browning. So overdeveloped tends to have a darker ground color relative to the same whole bean color. Underdeveloped tends to have a lighter ground color relative to the same whole bean color. But for some people, an overdeveloped coffee, for me, is perfectly developed. And for me, sometimes my idea of what an underdeveloped coffee is perfect for someone else. So once again, we are subjective here. Over and under roasted. So when we're talking about over roasted or under roasted, what we're really meaning is that the final temperature or the final color is either too dark or too light relative to what we've decided is good. So under roasted ends at a lower temperature, over roasted ends at a higher temperature, but more importantly, over and under roasted end at different colors. So a lighter color for under roasted and a darker color for over roasted. The reason I'm making this distinction is a lot of the times we have to be careful that we assume that a thermocouple is telling us the exact temperature of the surface of the beans and the exact color we expect them to come out, but sometimes it doesn't work out. So you just kind of want to keep that in mind. So sometimes you can actually have an over roasted coffee that has the same end temperature, but that's a story for another day. Under roasted coffee is going to tend to taste grainy, cereally. It's going to have a little bit of that same vegetal metallic characteristic because some of those acids that are a little bit unpleasant haven't been cooked off yet. Over roasted is going to tend toward roast character and chocolatey. So that's kind of how I would describe that. But once again, if you want a chocolatey coffee, then it's not over roasted. In that case, an over roasted coffee would be one that tastes ashy. And if you want an ashy coffee, then that's fine too. Over roasted means it's turning into carbon. If you want carbon, that's great. It means that when you caught the roaster on fire, you've over roasted. So that's kind of the aim that we're going at there. Now, there can be combos of these two. You can have over roasted and underdeveloped. where you get a style of coffee that I would like to call acidic chocolate. You can have overdeveloped and under-roasted, where you have a coffee that just tastes flat and very kind of nothing instead of tasting, properly developed or having that chocolatiness that you're looking for. So all of these can kind of be intermixed and interplayed. So it's oversimplifying it if we just say, oh, this coffee tastes underdeveloped. It's like, well, do you mean, what does that mean? That sort of thing. And then finally, my favorite and least favorite terminology in the coffee industry, which is baked. So right now I've got kind of 3 different ways in which people commonly describe baked, and we'll go through each of them. The only sure thing that you can know is if somebody says your coffee tastes baked, it means that they didn't like it. As with terminology around color for coffee, like Italian and French and full city and all this, in our industry, there is not a common vernacular around baked. People do the best to describe baked with what they think it means, and it kind of gets thrown around a lot. Same thing with roasty. Baked and roasty are kind of thrown around like barbs, basically, where people are saying, I don't like your coffee for whatever reason. It's not my preference. And so I'm using this basically as an insult against your coffee. When you're trying to describe descriptively, you do have to ask where people are coming from when they describe baked. So the 3 different ways in which we see it defined are, so the current SCA definition, and this comes from Morton Munchau's research, is basically an overly long development time. So according to the current SCA literature, baked coffee is a coffee that is incredibly light roasted, but also with an incredibly long development time, 5, 6, 7 minutes worth of development time. So it's very long, very drawn out. Everything is basically gone from it. So it's kind of like overdeveloped to the nth degree, right? Now, Scott Rayo's definition is that when the rate of rise crashes too sharply after first crack, and basically you get the falling off the hill, that's how he would define baked. And so sometimes baked means that the person thinks that when you're roasting, you cut the gas too soon after first crack or lowered your gas too far. And as a result, the coffee has a cereal, grainy sort of taste as well. And a lot of these we're kind of defining in a similar terminology set, at least between Rayo and SCA. Some of the flavor descriptors are the same. The new SCA one is a little bit more like overdeveloped, which is kind of like dull, nothing, right? The old SCAA terminology was basically that as you're roasting along and you go into sugar caramelization, chains of carbohydrates are linking together for the forming of the caramel compounds and all this sort of thing. And somehow or another you lose temperature, but then you push your burner back up and you regain temperature. So this is actually where we dip below caramelization temp and then come back up. And as a result, the chains of carbohydrates that are linking together can't just pick up where they've left off. And so you end up with a chemical defect that they would refer to as baked. When I've replicated this for different SCAA courses, the way that I'd like to describe it to you is like tortilla chips, where it's kind of got this corny, sweet grain sort of flavor, even though everything else has been carried on appropriately and you've hit the right end temperature, end color sort of thing. So those are the 3 major definitions of baked. I think it's helpful for you to describe, if you're going to use the term baked, why you think it's baked and which one you think it is in reference to, since it's so clouded. In fact, you may even just take out the word baked, and if you're going to follow Scott Rayo's methodology, you'd say, hey, it feels like to me your rate of rise dropped a little fast after first crack, instead of calling it baked, because it's a confusing term, so that sort of thing. So food for thought on that. Roasty, once again, we're roasting coffee. It had better taste roasty. Otherwise, you could just put green beans in, dump it out real quick, and you'd be good to go, right? Coffee necessarily tastes roasty. Describing it as roasty basically says that in your personal opinion, the coffee has been over roasted, right? So you're getting roast character more than what you would like. But once again, remember that as long as somebody has a market for their coffee, as long as they coffee started scratching the itch of the consumer base. So just because it's roasty to you doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad thing, right? You could say, oh, this is a little darker than my preference. That's a much nicer way of saying it than saying, oh, your coffee tastes roasty, right? Yeah. It doesn't hurt to be nice to one another, as it turns out. All right, now we're going to move on to talk a little bit about objective coffee roasting defects. Are there any questions that have come up on subjective you feel like we should throw in here, Dennis, yet, or?
There's one that will come up a little bit later, but nothing right now.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive in. Scorching. So this subjective roast defect, known as scorching, is incredibly problematic. And the reason that it's problematic is because, as you can see from the picture, scorching doesn't show up in the final roasted product. It happen to you, and unless you're diligently pulling your trier or assured that your coffee roaster is not producing scorch marks, it'll only show up in the taste and it won't actually show up visually for you in your finished roasted product. So scorching is basically what happens when the metal on the coffee roasting machine becomes too hot, whether that's due to overly heating during the preheating phase, during charge, poor airflow conditions. There's a lot of different ways in which scorching can start to come about. And pretty much if you're not using your trier to check the coffee with some regularity, you're going to miss it. And I know a lot of people don't like to pull the trier because they're concerned about, air intermingling or things cooling off or probe readings going down. But there are some things that it's really worth pulling your trier for early in the roast to see if you're experiencing scorching.
Hey, Rob.
Yes.
So Naomi asked if you could describe what the marks on the image are. Can you be more specific?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see this little black mark right here on this. I just realized you may not be able to see my mouse. Let me annotate real quick, and that'll help. Spotlight. So now you should be able to, whoop, went too far. Coming back. So can you see where I'm pointing now or no? The spotlight may have failed.
It's difficult to see. I just see a very tiny cursor, Rob.
Okay, I will draw. There we go. So that little black mark there, you can see these kind of scorching or dark marks here. These are from basically coming in contact with too hot of metal. And in this particular instance, and there's one right there, in this particular instance, I overheated the drum. And so we started seeing scorch marks show up pretty soon after charge. This was a very fast roast of about 3 minutes in time. So this little black side of the bean expands and goes into first crack. So that's kind of what we're pointing out there. Okay, go ahead and clear that. And
so Rob, there's a question from Rob. Is there a specific temperature when scorching occurs? Is there a highest temperature you would recommend charging at to avoid scorching?
That's a wonderful question. And that kind of brings us into some of the causes for it. So the unfortunate answer to the question is there's no temperature setting I can recommend for your roaster without knowing a lot about your setup. So there's a few ways scorching can happen, and we kind of alluded to it, but let's dive into each. So the first is just preheating too hot. But what is preheating too hot? So on a traditional drum roaster, for example, like the one you see right behind me, I can charge to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which is, let's see, that'd be roughly 230 centigrade. For those of you operating in centigrade, I can charge that hot if my airflow is all the way open when I'm preheating. If my airflow is partially closed or at 50-50 when I'm preheating, then I'm going to actually cause scorching at that exact same charge temperature. So it's hard to give an exact preheat temperature that's going to help you avoid scorching because it's multivariate, right? It has to do with how fast the airflow is moving through the system, if you have back pressure in the system. So on an old roaster I was on in Cincinnati, an old Ambex, we were roasting along just fine for a long time. And then suddenly we started to see scorching show up on our beans. And it was actually because no one had been doing maintenance on ventilation ducting. And since no one had been doing maintenance on ventilation ducting, we were getting back pressure. And so the air speed was essentially lower. So now our charge temperature was too high, not because we had changed the fan setting on the roaster, but because the poor ventilation maintenance had caused back pressure, which simulated lower airflow. So there's a lot of different ways it can come about, or an animal dies inside your smokestack. If that happens, it can cause some back pressure too. So you just got to be cognizant of when scorching starts to happen. Generally, if you notice it, the ways to go about solving that issue are lowering your charge temperature or lowering your initial heat application, or doing some sort of combination of soaking, which is basically where you leave your heat energy input down for the first 30 seconds to minute and a half of the roast, and then bring it up as you go along so that the beans can absorb energy from the metal help cool the metal down, and then you start pushing the heat in. But then there are also, unfortunately, some manufacturers that just have mechanical defects with the way that their machines operate, and scorching is really difficult to avoid. So there's a mix of all kinds of different stuff that can cause it, whether it's like something that's unavoidable, you're trying to roast too quickly, you're charging too hot, there's ventilation back pressure issues. All of those things can contribute to scorching. Hopefully that is it's a non-answer that is hopefully a helpful non-answer to your question. Yeah. Was there any others that came up concerning this?
There was a question actually from a couple people about whether or not a fluid bed roasting machine would mitigate the potential for scorching.
So yeah, there's a lot of ways in which mechanically you can avoid scorching. And one of them is just by avoiding direct heat on the drum. So like DeLorean, for example, I've never been able to produce scorching on there despite my best efforts trying to produce the defect for roast defect classes. It usually requires some sort of direct heat to the metal in order to overheat it, or if you kind of jailbreak it and change your preheat settings and overheat the machine, then you could theoretically do it. Fluidized beds, it is difficult to cause the scorching defect for sure, because usually they don't preheat hot enough. But if you choose incredibly hot scorching defect, basically if you overheat the metal at any point, you're going to cause the scorching defect to happen. And I realized too, I forgot to cover the flavor of scorched coffee. So scorching kind of has a flavor of, there's like an ashy character or like a burnt cookie character. Like, you know, when you're eating a cookie and it tastes great, but then there's that subtle burnt note in the background. So you may have roasted a coffee that tastes otherwise absolutely fabulous, but in the background, there's this lingering, roasty, ashy, bitter taste that you don't know exactly what it's from. And it's from those areas on the seed that got over roasted due to scorching, due to contact with that hot metal. That burnt, charred plant material ends up going through the grinder, going into the brewer, and then you end up tasting it as a result. So if everything tastes great about your coffee, except there's this kind of roasty, ashy character, it could be from scorching. So that's when it's really important to be pulling your early stages. We're talking to tan and looking to make sure that you don't see little black specks showing up on the roasted coffee. Cool. And just so everybody knows, I'm not looking at the chat when I'm letting Dennis deal with all that, because holy cow, it just keeps popping up. Good on you though.
Yeah, there's a lot of good questions. I'm trying to feed the ones that are related to the topic you're currently on. So I've got a list. I'm listening, folks. If I haven't responded to your question, I'm just holding it to the relevant time.
Woo-hoo. All right, so let's move on from scorching a little bit to one that's a little bit easier to see because it shows up in the final roasted product. Facing. Facing is, it really sounds like a 1980s, 1990s insult you would hear in high school, but it's not. What it is it's a defect that's similar to scorching, but it happens at the end of the roast. Here you can see the faced coffee. You can see where it's burnt and kind of starting to oil out a bit, burnt and starting to oil out. There's even a little bit down here where the rest of the coffee looks fine. The way that facing typically happens is going to be by overloading the coffee roaster. If you overload the coffee roaster, as the coffee expands, especially those of you who do dark roast, we get close to 100% volume expansion. Lighter roasts are more like 30%. So even if you fill a coffee roaster half full, if you're doing a second crack dark roast, it's going to be majority full by the time you're done with the roast because of volume expansion. So you want to be careful not to overload the roaster, because if you overload it, then beans get stuck against the outside walls of the drum where they're just constantly getting that conductive heat energy, and that's causing the facing defect. It can also happen if beans get trapped in any particular place, or theoretically, if you're applying a tremendous amount of heat to the metal at the end of the roast, that could cause an overheat or a hot spot. So that is one particular way in which this can happen too. And I forgot to mention one thing about scorching that I do think is very apropos, which is that if you are experiencing scorching, another way to get rid of it is actually to increase your airflow. The way I like to describe it's like buttering toast. Your burners are putting heat on the drum like pads of butter. And if you don't spread it out by kind of running airflow across it, it's not going to dissipate that heat as evenly. So by adding a little bit of airflow into the mix, you're able to then prevent yourself from having overly hot spots on the drum kind of by spreading that out just a bit and removing this issue. Facing isn't usually caused by that because most people go from lower airflow to higher airflow toward the end of the roast. And so you don't really see facing show up as an issue unless beans are getting caught if you're operating with higher airflow toward the end of the roast. Facing is obvious. Facing has a similar taste fault where there's just like this burnt roasty character to the coffee. You will sometimes have coffee that doesn't char, but it does oil out a little bit in spots here and there. Some of that can be agricultural. So, and I know this is a roasting defects class, but if you see oil spots on some beans and not on others, but there's no darkness associated with it, it could just be from the coffee getting dried too quickly at the mill, which can sometimes cause cellular damage, which then allows the oils to kind of slip out as you're roasting the coffee instead of having them retained until hitting a point where the cell walls break down.
Hey, Rob, I have a question from Matt.
Yeah.
Could environmental temperature play into scorching and facing? For example, roasting in the summer and the winter, you approach roasting different based on the season to minimize scorching and facing.
Yeah, it's possible that it could, but we're talking about very small differences and relative to roasting. Because I mean, if we're talking about going from 20 C up to 30 or 40 C, even if we're talking an extreme, so like room temperature up, that's pretty small in relation to where we're charging, which is going to be maybe 200 C or something like that, 200, 230. So there is, while it's possible, it's probably a little bit more minimal. That being said, if your product temperature is hotter, then you should probably have a lower charge temperature as well, because there's really no need if your product temperature is a little bit hotter to push it with as much force, or maybe a lower initial burner setting, that sort of thing. Whereas if it's cold or very high humidity, then you might have to charge hotter, push with more burner, that sort of thing. So I could almost see people trying to mitigate cold weather causing scorching more easily than kind of roasting in hotter climates. Cool.
Rob, is there a difference in the taste or the profile in the cup between scorching and facing?
Not particularly. They're both going to be kind of similar outcomes where everything tastes fine except for this overall roasty character. Facing is going to be a bit more random in terms of which beans have it and which don't, but the spots are going to be larger. So you might get a little bit more variability cup to cup on the cupping table or something like that.
Okay, that was a question from Sean. Thank you, Sean.
Boom, love that graphic. This is chipping. So chipping is a very, very interesting roasting defect. The nice thing about chipping, it is a visual only defect. There is no flavor defect associated with chipping. This is a great example, frankly, from friends of mine. But basically what happens during chipping is you get a pocket of moisture or a pocket of pressure inside the seed, inside the bean as it's roasting. And for one reason or another, we reach a certain point in the roast where the structural capacity of that coffee seed to hold that chip in place is overcome by the amount of pressure in the bean, and the chip blows off, leaving this moon-like crater on the seed. Once again, not going to be a flavor issue. It is going to be a visual impact if you're selling whole bean coffee, especially if you're selling whole bean coffee like in a clear container at the grocery store, or if you've got people that are really picky when they're looking at their coffee seeds after they bought them from you before they grind them. But the good news is it's not going to be a flavor issue. Chipping usually happens at darker roast levels. I also have a kind of a random theory about it, which I don't know if it's substantiated or not, but I think it has something to do with glass transition temperature. So glass transition is basically, it happens in epoxy and other things as well. It's when we go from a glassy hard state to a malleable leathery state, and then back to a glassy hard state. So when we're talking about coffee, we start out in a glassy hard state. The green coffee is very hard, very dense. And as we begin to apply heat energy to it, usually right after turning point or minute, 2 minutes into the roast, the coffee's gone from being hard to actually being a little bit malleable. And you've probably noticed this if you've accidentally pinched a bean in the dryer and it smashes instead of cracking or prevents you from pulling the dryer out altogether. And basically, so we've moved through glass transition, which is great. It allows coffee to swell, expand. It also allows coffee to hold the tremendous amount of pressure it does without just fracturing or exploding. But glass transition is also based on moisture content. And as you're roasting darker and darker, your moisture content's going lower and lower, which is also then lowering the glass or changing the glass transition temperature to a higher temp. So you might cross in at like 50, 70 C, somewhere in there, but on your way out might be 140 C. So usually if you're doing a light roast coffee, we go through glass transition fairly quickly in the cooling tray. So when it comes out, it's still kind of pliable. And if you're somebody who eats coffee beans, you've noticed this, you bite down immediately out of the cooling tray, it might still be kind of soft. A few seconds in the cooling tray, you bite down and it's crunchy. And that's because it's gone back through glass transition. With darker roasted coffee, because our moisture content's getting down closer to 1%, it's possible that we can go through glass transition while still in the roaster. And I'm wondering if that's what causes this, because suddenly the bean goes from this like malleable, leathery state to a, brittle state, and then the pressure overcomes it and blows the chip off. But neither here nor there, right?
Rob, Andrew would like to know if chipped coffee will go stale faster.
Theoretically, it might, because the inner surfaces are exposed. But remember, the thing that's protecting roasted coffee is actually the CO2 off-gassing. And so we still have CO2 off-gassing out of that, which is kind of shrouding the coffee in its own like protective blanket, essentially. And with darker roasted coffee, it actually loses the CO2 faster because the cellular structure is a little bit more damaged. So I would expect it to age a little quicker, mostly because it's a dark roast and not necessarily because of the chipping. But it is possible that that exposure might cause a little bit of faster aging at that point. Good questions, though. All right, tipping. So tipping is not what happens when you visit a restaurant, which none of us remember what that feels like, thanks to COVID. But tipping is what happens when, in coffee roasting, when you're roasting a coffee faster than the density would allow. So when we're roasting coffee, remember, we're not just applying heat evenly. The bean doesn't just absorb it all uniformly. That's not the case. In certain papers that are focused on thermodynamics and coffee roasting, there's a numerical model for heat and mass transfer during coffee roasting is the name of one of the scientific articles. It shows how heat actually impacts the seed, and where the seed is thinnest, the heat impacts it more significantly, which is going to be kind of at the edges. So when you're roasting coffee, the edges are going to get heated a little bit faster than the core, which is going to be heated a little bit more slowly. And the outside surface is getting heated significantly faster than the interior surface. If you're roasting too quickly, one of the soft spots on the bean is where the embryo would have germinated and formed the root system and stem that would have then lifted up and poked through the ground. That area on the coffee seed tends to be a little bit less dense, a little bit softer than other spots. And so the embryo in that spot can char ahead of the rest of the roast. And so this is a high density Colombian, but I'm roasting this high density Colombian from beginning to end in 3 minutes. You can see here, we've got a little bit of white discoloration on the green bean, just kind of right, let me do my annotate thing here. Right there. You can start to see a little bit of discoloration showing up even early in the yellowing stage. Here we've got an exact blowhole for the steam. It's almost like it was a whale coming up to shoot a little blast of water into the air, but it was actually steam pressure that was being released. Here you can see, once again, the premature darkening continues on all the way through the roast. Tipping is nice because you can see tipping. Roasted product. Taste tipping too, it's going to once again be a very similar flavor defect to facing and to scorching, because once again, we're just talking about inadvertently burning one part of the seed while the rest of the seed is roasting, normally, so to say. It's typically blamed on convection, but that's kind of a false narrative, because what happens is convection is the most efficient, I should say, means of heat transfer in a roasting system. And so if you're pushing a roast really fast, you're likely using more convection, and that's causing the coffee to roast faster than the density of that particular part will allow, which causes it to burn prematurely compared to the rest of the beans. So all you have to do to avoid tipping then is to slow down a little bit. So you slow your roast down, use maybe a little less charge temperature, a little less initial burner, bring everything into a kind of a more casual pace, and get to first crack maybe closer to 9 minutes, 10 minutes. And that should alleviate the problem. Now, there's a lot of different ways to roast coffee. Some people are roasting coffee where they're hitting first crack at 5 minutes. Some people are hitting first crack at 11, 12. There's not really right or wrong. Once again, this is all just kind of what you have to do decision-wise for your business in terms of what the flavors you're looking for come out. But let's say that you're accustomed to roasting with a 7-8 minute first crack, and you push it back to 9, you push back to 10. At a certain point, you're going to have to think business-wise, does the flavor of the coffee now taste worse that I've pushed it back, or worse for you that I've pushed first crack back so long relative to the tipping? Which one do I actually prefer the taste of? There have been some coffees that I've roasted where in order to get tipping to go away, we had to slow the coffee roast down so much that we actually preferred the flavor of the coffee tipped than we did at the slow roast speed that we had to do to alleviate tipping. Then it brings up questions about how you're purchasing and all that sort of thing. But if you're roasting fast, make sure to look for tipping when you're sample roasting, because you don't want it to show up in your regular roast. So use that as kind of a way to buy. If you're roasting slower, it kind of opens the door to you to buy a lot more low density coffees that isn't going to, it doesn't matter, because you're going to be roasting long enough that tipping probably won't happen. So
I got a couple tipping related questions, Rob. Yeah. Devin asks that when the beans split on the ends, air quotes, not tipping, is that a defect, and how does it affect flavor and roast?
When they split at the end. So I guess the follow-up question to that would be, did it show up in the green evaluation? Was there like a lot of broken beans? Because or is this like when they split at the ends in terms of just from expansion due to roasting and first crack? I'm going to operate under the assumption it's just due to roasting and first crack. It's not necessarily a defect that's going to cause flavor issues. It just means that when you hit first crack, it's fairly aggressive. And so what you're probably seeing is just a rapid expansion steam crack. You could choose to go a little slower. That would be fine. And probably not see that in the same way, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. Usually it kind of looks like almost like the cracks you'd get at your edge of your eyes from laughing too much, sort of thing, right? So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about that. It's when you see scorching that it's a real concern. Or not scorching the defect. It's when you see discoloration due to burning of plant material that it's a real concern. I have to be careful with my nomenclature as well.
And then apologize if I mispronounce your name. Dean wants to know if an older crop or dead embryo could also cause tipping.
Yeah, I mean, as coffee ages, it just becomes more and more fragile. So that is a possibility. I've also experienced tipping when the embryo made too much. I experimented with malting coffee once that did not go well, but we had a lot of tipping issues with that. So yeah, I mean, the status of the embryo could theoretically inform this as well. And so there's like, on the one hand, tipping could be a green issue. On the other hand, tipping could be a roasting issue as well. Yeah. Cool. So what causes roasting defects? We talked a little bit about this, but let's dive on in.
So Rob, let me throw you one more defect here. This is a new one.
Let's do it.
So Ben says, I noticed some shiny spots on a few beans, the light roast, and we filled the roaster to half capacity. Are there reasons for the shine on the beans?
So the shine, like the little bit of oil spots. So that would be kind of what we described earlier. That can be an agricultural. If fast or if storage conditions were improper and it got overly hot, it can cause cellular damage. So then you get a little bit of oil leaking out, even though the coffee's light roasted. You'll notice this a lot with decaf too. You have a light roasted decaf that's fully oiled out like it's a French roast, and that's because of the cellular damage that happens during some decaffeination processes, right? So pretty much if the cell structure breaks it, because all coffees have oil in it, light roast, dark roast, you're not creating oils when we're roasting. It's just whether or not they're still retained inside the cell walls or not. And as those cell walls get broken down due to pyrolysis in the darker roasting, that's why the oils tend to come out. Now, if you have cellular damage for any other reason, those oils can come out even at a light roast color. So that's a great question. Right on. So what causes roasting defects? One thing is just roasting too fast. Roasting fast is totally fine. There's some delicious coffees that go that way, but not every single coffee needs to be roasted quickly in order to taste good. That's just kind of something that we need to accept and be okay with. Even some incredibly new, amazing experimental process lots actually do a little bit better with a longer roasting style. And so it's kind of one of those things where in modern roasting, it's how fast can you go, it feels like, or how low can you go on development, or how low can you go on your end temperature, how light can you roast your color. But that's not all coffees. Some coffees you got to just take your time with, go a little slower, apply heat more gently, and the coffee will still taste fabulous. In fact, it'll probably taste better than it did in overly fast roasting style. So roasting too fast can cause scorching. Roasting too fast can cause tipping. Those are the two primary ones that you're going to see from roasting too fast. So we're talking about like fast, trendy, light roasting styles, right? Roasting too dark is where you're going to get chipping, and often that's where you'll get face. Roasting too fast, if we're talking subjective, could lead people to call your coffee baked or underdeveloped or under roasted or any of these sorts of things. So sometimes it's good to just take a step back, slow it down a little bit, and see where you can go, right? On the other hand, roasting too slow can also be a huge problem. If you're roasting too slow, this is where you start to get flavors like overdeveloped, over roasted, those sorts of things, which are subjective. But roasting too slow can also then just cause the coffee to taste very muted and uninteresting to you. But if that's what you're going for, then rock and roll with that too. There's no right or wrong, there's just shades of difference. Unwanted thermal conductivity can be a huge problem. So if you're putting too much heat on the metal, if the metal of the drum is too thin, if the RPM of the drum is too slow, all of these things can cause unwanted thermal conductivity, which can cause hot spots on your roaster, which can then cause the beans to be scorched as they come in contact with the metal surfaces of your drum, or potentially fluidized bed chamber, depending on how the roaster is set up. So unwanted thermal conductivity, in particular unwanted conduction or overly high conduction temperatures, can cause issues. So that's something to be aware of also. And ways to avoid roasting defects.
Hey, Rob.
Oh, yeah.
There was a question about the length of time for roasting. Rob wants to know if you determine the roasting speed according to measurements that you take off the green bean, such as the density, moisture content, processing, etc.
Yes and no. So on the one hand, when you have low density coffee, you're kind of stuck roasting a little longer if you don't want to cause tipping. When you have higher density coffee, sky's the limit. You can roast fast, but you can also choose to roast slow and have good results either way. So in terms of density and moisture and stuff like that, that's not really determining how you should roast a coffee. What really determines how you should roast the coffee is what flavors you're looking for, right? So this is outside of the scope of this, but generally speaking, if you want a more savory coffee, you're probably looking at a longer roast. If you want a more floral coffee, you're probably looking at a shorter roasting style, right? Those are going to be the two things that I would think about in terms of large flavor categories first. And savory doesn't necessarily mean meaty. You can have something that's savory sweet, like you can have a savory chocolate, or a savory like sweet nutty sort of thing like toffee. But if you want that and you want floral, you're kind of having to aim for the middle ground between those two. So those don't really impact the speed at which you choose to roast, but they impact the speeds at which you're probably able to roast. Moisture content does a few things. High moisture content means you're going to have a lot more trouble pushing heat energy into the coffee. So as you go up in terms of water content, you have more water to send through phase change. And so because water has to go through the latent heat of vaporization, basically it takes more energy to go through phase change from 100 C liquid to 100 C gas than it does to go from 0 centigrade to 100 centigrade. So you're having to throw a lot of extra heat energy at the coffee just to get the water to go through phase change so that you can get to first crack. So the wetter the coffee, usually the harder you have to push with your burner. So if you have a wet, high density coffee, sometimes it can be very difficult to roast it at the speed you might want, unless you're having a slower roasting style already. So it's kind of a roundabout way of not answering your question, but giving you information that's associated with your question. So hopefully that's helpful. Any others that have come up, Dennis?
I will keep on trucking. I've got a list here that I'm monitoring. Some are a little generic, so I'll probably save those for the end.
Perfect. All right, how do we avoid roast defects? So one is with more convective heating. Scorching and facing are both going to be conduction-oriented defects. And so if you use more convection, the only thing you have to worry about is making sure that your roasting speed is not too fast. So convective heating, and that'll help you avoid tipping. So convective heating is a great way to make sure that you aren't experiencing some of these roasting defects, right? Making sure you have adequate fan speed, making sure that your ventilation is unclogged, using a roaster that is aimed toward convective heating. All of these things are going to be useful. And most roasters, by the way, are predominantly convective. Most people, like a lot of people think there's this like huge difference between certain brands. And the reality is most drum roasters use at least 60, 70% convective heat energy in them, if not more, right? So there's not this huge difference that most people assume that there is. So it's okay to use your airflow. It's okay to turn up your drum speed to increase the amount of convection that you're getting during coffee roasting. That's another thing. If your drum speed's too slow, the beans are going to sit on the metal for too long. And if they sit on the metal for too long, the opportunities to cause scorching and facing are going to increase. So higher fan speeds, or using some fan speed, coupled with a higher drum speed, are really going to kind of help alleviate some of those issues and give you some pretty fast, nice roasting speeds that are super controllable, right? Okay, so that's one way, convective heating. The other one is thorough agitation and proper sizing. So this is an S70 drum loaded to full capacity, and watch it chuck those beans. At the rate at which it's going, it feels like an old, I don't know, an old website from the GeoCities days, a little bit. I don't know. Something's gonna start following my mouse around for those of you who are familiar with that.
Just for everybody's benefit, if your video speed is like mine, that is not real-time video. That is this.
Oh no, it's slow motor. Sorry.
Clear. That's not how fast it actually spins.
It actually creates a vacuum and anti-gravity environment in which the coffee falls much slower than you would expect. I'm just kidding. So what's really important to note, though, is the purpose of the drum is to lift the coffee up into the hot air stream and let it cascade through. And so the drum actually plays a massive role in terms of convective heat energy transfer, because the beans are then brought up into this hot air mass and allowed to fall through it, where they pick up a lot of energy. And this is how most roasting systems work. The drum is actually, yes, it provides conduction, but also the shape of the paddles inside the drum and the way the drum is moving is supposed to not only mix the coffee, but also loft it into the hot air stream to roast the coffee. You'll also notice that there's plenty of space in this. The S70, I think, is only 20% filled when you actually have a full capacity batch in there, which means even if you went to a very dark roast, you're still only at about 40% of the overall fill volume of the drum. So you want to make sure that in your roaster, whatever you're using, you're not overfilling the drum. Overfilling it can cause lots of problems due to expansion. And just kind of be aware of, you know, how full your roaster gets. And especially if you're doing dark roasts, that can be a real thing. So making sure that the drum is lofting the coffee enough, that it's agitating the coffee plenty, and that you have proper sizing relative to your batch size. So you're not overfilling. Oh, and if you click the screen, it actually goes again. There we go. And then the other thing is, honestly, it's good to have lots of data. It's not good to have all of the data necessarily, because the data has to be it has to be useful to you. But we're at this really amazing advantage that people that were roasting in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s didn't have. We have a lot of data at our fingertips. And so by monitoring things like your air temperatures, your incoming air temperature, your outgoing air temperature, your bean temperature, being able to visualize things like rate of rise or see it calculated for you on the screen. All of these things are going to help you steer your roasts in the direction that you want them to go. And so if you're worried about overdevelopment or underdevelopment, if you're worried about over or under roasting, we have so much information now available to help you avoid those things. It's absolutely fabulous. And a lot of people are moving now to thinner thermocouples, which, you know, Loring's is great at 1.5 millimeters. It's thin, it's responsive, you get the data quick. 3 millimeters, which you see a lot in the industry now, awesome, really responsive, really quick. Much better than the old days when I can remember roasting on 6 millimeter probes, where you make an adjustment that you may not ever actually see show up on the probe because of the thermal lag of the probe itself. So we've got thinner probes, we're getting better data, and we're getting more data, which we can use to, and it's not just to have, we can actually use all that data in order to steer how we're roasting. Like looking at your air temperatures, for example, to really understand the heat transfer that's happening in the system. Air temperatures aren't just there for charging, they're there to actually run the roast by as well. stuff like that. Rate of rise, all these things. I can remember having Excel sheets back in the day where the Excel sheet would automatically calculate rate of rise as I did my 30-second measurements. We've gone a long way from that, right? So, oh yeah, then a responsive beam thermocouple. So this is a Loring thermocouple here in front of a nice wood work table. Oh, and that's it. We hit the end faster than I thought we might.
So Rob, let me give you a couple of questions that I've been holding on to in chat, and then
Good.
try opening it a little more. So Monica, thanks for your patience, Monica, asked this quite early on. Are there any defects caused by not cleaning the equipment appropriately?
Yes, scorching is one of the big ones. If the ventilation piping is clogged or congested, it simulates reduction in airflow, which can easily cause hot spots on the drum and cause scorching. So if you're noticing that could actually be on your cleaning regimen. So just remember, anybody who's roasting on a traditional roaster, you need to be checking your vent piping probably every month, especially if you're roasting dark or roasting a lot. So check it frequently, please.
Next up is Dan would like to know if some types of beans are more prone to scorching than others.
Theoretically, softer, lower density coffee might be, but once again, this comes from a control issue more than it does anything else. If you see scorching on one coffee, you're probably seeing scorching on other coffee and maybe just not paying attention to it. And that's where, once again, pulling the trier early is going to be really important. So I guess if there's a particular coffee that you're running into this issue with, it can be worth getting a second opinion. I remember back in the day, we had a Guatemalan coffee that was having scorching. And so we actually we packaged up like a kilo and sent it back to the importer and asked them if they could roast it and see if they were having the same issue or not. So like uneven moisture content in the seeds could cause that. Some other green quality issues might cause scorching, but mostly it's probably going to be preheat conditions or pushing too much heat energy into the coffee. So if you have it in one, look for it in all of your others and see if you notice it.
Gary would like to know if too much convective heat can cause over roasting of the surface of the coffee and make it taste baked.
So this is a very interesting question, and it's a bit of a quandary, right? So by too much convection, I'm going to talk about it more in terms of like, let's talk drum roasters first, and then we'll move on to fluid bed, because fluid bed is in a different class altogether because the airflow is so much faster, right? So like, for example, if you look at the Ikawa runs per gram of coffee 6 times more airflow than a Loring does full tilt, right? And Loring runs more airflow than some other roasters, but it's a category of massive scale, right, in terms of difference. So in drum roasters, more airflow is probably not going to cause the coffee to have any roasting issues per se. I've been doing some experimentation with a traditional drum roaster that, because people say, oh, well, too much airflow is going to dry out the coffee, or too much airflow is going to do X, Y, Z. Airflow is really just a means of heat transfer control. And when you increase your airflow, what can happen is it can throw off other things. So like, for example, you increase your airflow, your burner is probably not going to be able to keep up with the higher airflow. And so your roasting speed is probably going to go slower. And that slower roasting is probably actually going to result in the flavor difference that you're noticing. If you speeds achieve the exact same roast in terms of timing of events and in color, we're probably not going to talk about noticing much of a difference at all. Now, theoretically, temperature difference between interior and exterior of the coffee is going to be caused primarily by rate of heat transfer, because as soon as it contacts the surface, it does move into the center, it just moves at a certain rate. And so there's always kind of this differential between them. Then at the end of the roast, when you lower your heat application, the inner and outer bean temperatures come a little bit closer together because now you've stabilized and the heat's now penetrating into the inside a bit more. So the faster you roast, the more uneven the coffee will be regarding the interior and exterior. So that's more of a question of roasting speed and less of a question of convection or heat energy transfer via convection. Now, when we're talking about fluidized bed systems, we're pushing so much more airflow through that the airflow has a tendency to overwhelm the coffee and what it's going to want to do, which sounds weird. Coffee doesn't have its own like free will or anything like that. But what I've noticed in terms of working with fluidized bed roasters is that your delta or your difference between your whole bean and ground color typically stays a little bit bigger, because even when you turn down your heat application at the end of the roast, you still have a lot of airflow moving over the coffee. And that tends to try and prop up the whole bean exterior temperature to a certain point, which tends to make the whole bean color a little bit darker relative to the ground color that you would have. So on a drum roaster, you can get this like big delta of like, let's say 70 whole bean agtron, 110 or 109 agtron ground fine. And you put that on a fluidized bed roaster and try and do the same thing, and it becomes a little bit more difficult. You hit the 109 ground, but now you're at 65 or 62 instead of 70 for your exterior color. So hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Rob. Let's see. Zach would like to know if there's any way to overcome a small potato defect.
Ooh, potato is agricultural.
And those quotes were Zach's quotes. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't normally talk air quotes.
I like the air quotes though. And for those who aren't familiar, potato defect is a defect where it's due to microbes and funguses and insects and all sorts of things. So it's usually isolated to coffees from Rwanda, Burundi, and I think DRC now might have some of this influence. And someone can correct me if I'm wrong in the chat window. But basically what happens is one bean here and there has potato defect, and it is usually very potent, and it tastes like you're eating a raw cut potato while you're drinking the coffee. And it can, if it's a really strong potato defect, it could, ruin a couple liters of brewed coffee, right? And the downside is it's agricultural, and it doesn't really do much different with roasting. You could roast it darker, and you could kind of take it toward chocolate, or a little bit toward darker roast ashen second crack sort of area, and probably minimize the impact that way. But in terms of roasting it at a different profile for a lighter roast, it's just not gonna really happen. It's no reason to avoid those countries at all. In terms, they have some amazing, beautiful coffees. But when you're buying, instead of doing a 5-cup cupping, you might want to do a 10 or a 15-cup cupping, and see how often the incidence occurs in those 15 cups, and then make your buying decision based off that, instead of just doing a traditional 5-cup cupping and saying, 1 in 5, it's not too bad. Is it 1 in 5, or is it 2 in 15, or is it 1 in 15? Like, those things will help you make a more informed decision on that.
Benmar would like to know if using a roasted coffee color meter would help you detect any roast defects.
Ooh, also hi to Benmar, long time no see. Yeah, the color meters, they could inform you of over or under development based on the delta between your whole bean and ground color, but that's going to be things that you set yourself. I am not aware of any color meters currently that do visual readings or video readings that would be able to detect, say, tipping, for example, or something along those lines. So currently there's no color meters that really would ping it for you. It would be more of like, if you're looking at the subjective roasting defects and determine what over and underdeveloped means for you in terms of the delta between your whole bean and ground at a certain grind level, that would be a possibility. Or over roasted and under roasted, right? So over roasted and under roasted, we do all the time, where it's like, this is the expected color value of this coffee. And if we don't hit it, if we're over or if we're under, then it flags it for cupping, right?
Felix would like to know, does it make sense to charge as hot as possible without scorching the bean to avoid underdeveloping the beans?
So we've got a mixed idea, but this is something that's very common. So your charge temperature has nothing to do with development. Your charge temperature is all about how fast you want to roast, right? So your development has to do with how long between first crack and the end of the roast. And the reason for that is this really fun, complicated thing that happens when you're roasting coffee, which I wish I had a picture of. I should put like an appendix in these, Dennis, where it's like all my pictures that I like to cycle through. So if you look at a bean cut in half, when you're roasting, what you can actually see is that the exterior surface of the bean is darker and the interior is lighter. when you're roasting before first crack. And that's because the heat application is going from the outside in. You know, there's no magic in coffee. It's always heat transfer from the outside in. If you cut a bean in half when it's roasted and notice that the interior looks a little darker than the exterior, that's simply because sugar isn't stored evenly in the coffee. There's no roaster that roasts from the inside out, full stop, on the market at all. And I wouldn't recommend microwaving green coffee. I've tried that once before and it did not go well. But anyway, it's because there's more sugar stored in the inner belt. Where there's sugar, there's browning, and so it browns more, so it becomes darker. Now, when we're talking about development time, you can see a very clear distinction line, a very clear boundary line where there's color change happening on the outside because most of the water is gone from the outside surface of the seed. And sugar browning, like Maillard reaction and sugar caramelization, don't like to happen in the presence of water. The water has to be cooked off for it to go through browning. So the exterior surface will brown, the interior surface will remain greenish, tannish. Right? It's going through some chemical reactions, but it's not really going through the ones that the outside surface is seeing yet because all the water is still stored in there. When first crack happens, it allows all that water to escape from the coffee seed. When all that water escapes, now the browning starts going from the outside surface inward. And that's where we get development. That's why we talk about development. Now, the longer period of time you give from when first crack starts happening to when you in the roast, the more chance the heat has to move in and cause those chemical reactions now that the water has moved out. And so that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about development. So if you charge low, that's totally fine. You're not going to end up with underdeveloped coffee unless you don't have a sufficient development time or you don't have a sufficient in temperature, which would actually be under roasted. Those are the two things that you would kind of be playing around with. So making sure you have, you know, the best starting spot for development time is about 90 seconds, a minute and a half. It's kind of what people all over the world are doing for light roasted coffee, roundabouts a minute and a half. Determining your in color or in temperature is going to be difficult because it's very machine specific, but a nice light color, if you're using any sort of agitron metering or color metering, is going to be like in that 70 to 109. So 70 whole bean, 109 ground. If you're grinding for espresso, that's like a great kind of starting spot. And then you can decide whether you want to go lighter or darker with it, but you should be fairly well developed at that point. You can also use weight loss as a guide. So if you've got that minute and a half development time, your weight loss should be over 11%. Just to be safe at first. Usually under 11%, I'm starting to worry about clients having some underdeveloped or under roasted characteristics. So just kind of play within those bounds and see what you can see. Now, that being said, if you prefer to roast quickly, then yeah, push it as hot as you can at the beginning and throw as much heat as you can without causing roasting defects. And you can do that very fast, kind of more modern, trendy style of roasting that we see out there a lot now. If you don't, then you can go slower too, and that's totally fine. I'm afraid you're muted, Dennis.
I was muted. I was double muted. We had only set aside an hour for this, but I want to make sure we have opportunity to address as many questions as we can. If people want to try to ask a question real time with Rob, if you will use the raise hand feature, I will see if I can enable that so you can ask your question real time. While I give folks a couple minutes to compose themselves, I've got two more queued up here, Rob.
Let's do it.
Safety asks, have you ever had an issue like inner scorching? The inside of the bean is darker than the outside.
Yeah, so the inner scorching, it's not necessarily scorching. So that's kind of what we talked about with the sugar content distributed. So I can annotate. Let me do that real quick. So we're going to do this really imperfectly, but it's going to be fun. All right, so let's say that this is our coffee seed. I forgot Zoom has all these cool features. I'm going to cut it in half. So this is our seed, right? So ignore this part. This part down here doesn't exist. Now, what you'll notice in the seed, and you get the little kind of curled up part like this, you might notice an inner band that kind of looks really, really dark on the inside, like this. Now, if you're tasting scorching, that could theoretically be scorched. And that's possible that it's just from roasting the coffee too quickly. So you're applying way too much heat, stuff just kind of goes crazy like that. But more likely than not, what that is just that there's more sugar content there. So then we've got our regular coffee bean color around here. So it just means there's more sugar there, so it darkens. Now, if you're getting the scorched flavor, then it might mean you need to slow down for that particular coffee. If you're not getting that scorched flavor, I wouldn't worry too much about the cutting it in half part here. what I'd really be looking at is, my mouse is having a habit of disappearing today. Where am I? I'm right there. All right. Clear this. What I'd really be focusing on is the difference between your whole bean and ground color. Okay, so if your whole bean and ground color, your ground is darker than your whole bean, that's a weird inverted situation that very infrequently happens. So if that happens, then you've got something fun going on. I've only seen that happen 3 times in my life, 2 times, with really, really darkly roasted Indonesian coffees. So like from Sumatra. That's the only time I've ever seen it. So.
Okay, let's give this a chance here. So Luca, you should have the ability to speak if you unmute your mic on your end. You have a question for Rob?
Hi.
Hi, Luca, we can hear you.
Hi, yeah. Look, first up, thanks Rob, and thanks to Loring for putting this on. I thought the question I wanted to ask was, given that the Loring has quite a different heating method from a lot of other roasters, and that you're sort of heating the air that's circulating around, can you talk to us about the impact of changing the RPM on the paddles in the Loring compared with changing the drum RPM on a more traditional drum roaster?
Yeah, and I can say, having worked with the engineers on some of this, that when it comes to the Loring, I wouldn't recommend messing around too much with the drum paddles. So the way that the Loring has kind of been tuned in is that you have the maximum drum speed that you can without sucking beans back into the cyclone. And so that's kind of maximizing your heat transfer. So if you were to turn down
the term for that, Rob, is chucking.
Oh, yeah, checking, exactly right. So when you hear the little ting, 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 as the beans are getting sucked back. So the way the Loring works is kind of strange because of how the balance in the system is kind of designed. So you have to be able to run the burner hot enough to cause incineration, but not so hot that you melt the stack. And you want to run the airflow at varying rates in order to cause heat transfer. And so how hot you get the stack coupled with how much air you're pulling through is kind of how the heat transfer functions. So at 100%, you're pushing as much heat into the coffee as the machine is capable of doing. Down at 20%, you're pushing the minimum amount of heat in while still having enough circulatory air to bring out smoke and chaff and particulate and stuff like that, and still be everything cause incineration. So the drum speed is kind of part of that, where if you change the drum agitation, the only way you would really want to go would be down, because if you go higher, you're going to be throwing beans more. But then if you go down, you're exposing it to less hot airflow movement. And so you end up getting slower roasting speeds and less efficiency in terms of the roasting environment. So adjusting your drum speed is really just going to impact your roasting efficiency when it comes to roasting on a Loring. So you turn your drum speed down, you're going to end up with slower roasting or not as great of capabilities. You turn your drum speed up, you're likely going to be sucking beans back the chute, would be the short answer.
Thanks.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thanks, Rob. It looks like Ben has a question. So Ben, you should be enabled there if you unmute yourself.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. So I just have a question. I currently have a 12 kilo Probot machine. And whenever we roast or dark roast coffee, the rate of rise obviously goes down, it declines, but whenever the first crack ends, it goes upward. So I was wondering if that was common for a dark roast as it's approaching second crack, or if when you roast it correctly, should it always decrease, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and this is one of those areas where it's kind of open for interpretation. So when it comes to medium roast and dark roast, I definitely vary from my friend Scott. I would say for me, a dip and a flick for a medium or a dark roast is kind of what I expect and or want, because I want to have a long enough development time to bring that acidity down. And the only way to get a long enough development time to a dark enough end color is kind of going to be to have that dip and bounce back up. So yeah, I think that you're totally fine in seeing that. And a lot of what we're seeing with the crash and flick sort of thing is all water content related as well, which is kind of why it's happening. So when you first get that big dump of water, you're seeing an adiabatic cooling reaction happen. The real question scientifically, in my mind, is, are the beans cooling, or is just the air around the thermocouple cooling? is a topic for another day. But then, once that water is dealt with, then there's nothing causing the bean temperature probe to sense any sort of cooling happening. And so it's going to pick back on up and carry on. So that would be the long, short answer. You can adjust your profile with lower charging temperatures, pushing a little bit more in the middle, that sort of thing, to try and shape it a little differently. But for the most part, I would expect to see that on a dark roast in particular.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Rob, I've got a question from Albert. I have experienced a defect that we cannot detect by how it looks visually, but we can detect when we grind it. Are you familiar with these cases?
Interesting. Oh, and Ben, I'll have you mute there, buddy. Sorry about that. All good. It would be hard to say. So sometimes you may not notice like scorching or tipping, but you might see little charred particles floating in the cupping bowl. I don't know if anybody here has ever experienced that. Let's do the party hat emoji reaction if you have. Yeah, the little charred bits kind of floating in the cupping bowl, that's something that you definitely do see. But in terms of, I guess I would need more information regarding that to see what you mean by you've detected a defect in the grinder. If that makes any sense.
Okay, Rob, let's see. Tom, it looks like you're live to go with this if you unmute.
Hey, Rob, great chat.
Hey, Tom, good to hear from you.
Yeah. Hey, I wanted to know if you had an opinion on these some of these newer drum coatings that had call it near infrared. I think it's almost like a Cerakote or a ceramic coating on the drum that's supposed to, I believe, kind of even out the heat conductivity. But and of course, I only am drawing from a hobbyist small 1-pounder roasting experience, and how it plays against airflow. I think my roaster is really more has a little bit more conductive oomph with that, but I just wondered if you've had some experience with it or any opinions on it, on what it does to the bean surface development.
Yeah, for sure. And Tom, are you still on that Victory roaster? Modded out though, of course.
Yeah. Santuker. Yeah.
I mean, there's been a lot of people playing around with it, kind of like chef's pans, right? I remember a long time ago there was a mod out or a picture that I saw from, I think it was Coffee Tech, had like this perforated drum, and then inside that was a copper layer, and then inside that was a solid core drum as well, to try and do kind of something like absorbs and evens everything out. And the anti-stick thing, from what I remember reading, it was a lot of it had to do with like trying to avoid having to do drum cleaning and stuff like that by things not being able to stick to it as much. But I can definitely see them including a bit about evening out heat distribution. And I think if you can even out heat distribution, that's a great thing. And you can do it by a number of different ways, like how you design the metal, how thick the metal is, what layers the metal drum has in it, how far the heat source is away from the drum is another one. So like by lowering the heat source just a little bit away from the drum, you can kind of cause that to even out and spread out a little bit more. So there's lots of different options, but I've never gotten to roast on or cup from basically a Teflon coated or a ceramic coated drum. So I don't know that it's going to impact too much flavor. My expectation would be that it wouldn't impact flavor, just because the coffee bean is it's doing so much internally because the heat that's being applied to it, everything's going outward instead of inward. That would be my gut take on it, is it's probably not going to make a huge difference, with the exception of potentially cleaning. But if they're doing some like cool heat distribution stuff too, I'm all for that. Removing hot spots and tipping it or scorching is a massive bonus.
Yeah, I just wondered what their impetus was for developing it, because their wording is kind of vague, just talking about most of their promotional stuff for it how it affects flavor. But,
That's interesting. I'll have to look into it. I mean, you know, with the Can You Taste the Roasting system work that Ann and I did, a lot of the stuff about flavor that people had said in the past has kind of been broken down, which is awesome. We never had the chance to do it on one of those, but we've used some really wildly different systems and kind of had the same results. So my gut take would be that it's probably more marketing oriented, but I could be wrong also. So, but I mean, if it cuts down on drum cleaning, anybody who's had to climb inside of a roaster drum and scrape knows that that's a good thing.
luckily, we're immune to that in the home setting. Pretty easy to clean them.
That's good.
Hey, thanks again, man.
Yeah, thanks to you.
Thanks, Tom. So it looks like we got one more question here from Chris. So Chris,
I'm putting this up to talk to you. Here's the white paper. Go to loring.com/blog. Chris, how's it going?
Hey, good, thanks, Rob. Yourself?
Good.
Hey, look, I had to duck out and make coffee earlier because we're open this time of day, and I missed some of the IR12 Scorching questions. Now, we're really struggling with larger batches of Scorching. And then over about 5 to start together, even if we run the air at 50-50 to get going. Now, the only two options I have left here is do we mess with drum speed, is that going to help? Or we can really slow down our drying phase. We're trying to keep it under 6 minutes, and at 7 kilos, we're at 6 minutes.
There's a fair bit of background noise, so what I'll do is I'll repeat the question and see if I got it, and you can just give me a thumbs up or not. So basically saying you're having trouble with larger batches in terms of being able to roast fast enough, and so you're kind of looking for ways to be able to roast a little bit faster. Is that close to?
Yeah, without scorching. So anything over about 5 or 6 kilos, we're wrestling with scorching.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah, drum speed is going to be where to look for that. So generally speaking, by increasing your drum speed, you're going to be lofting into that hot air more and more frequently. Yep. And so that's going to just really pick up your roasting speed quite dramatically. You should be able to gain a minute or two, depending on how long you're roasting currently.
Yeah, and that will help with the scorching, I'd imagine, because it's lofting the beans off the drum surface.
Absolutely true. Yeah, and there's a whole bunch of clients I've been helping lately that have been having trouble with one type of roaster that's been just giving them scorching issues, and pretty much all of those scorching issues have been solved by increased drum speed.
Awesome, good. I'll give it a bash. And are you coming to Melbourne this year?
Nope. But you're welcome to come to Oregon. I've got this lab here ready for people. So.
Next year.
No, I'm actually done with traveling. So I'm online though. I can come and join you via the internet anytime. So.
All right, cool. All right, that's right. Thanks.
Yep, of course. All right. Any other questions coming up here?
Okay, Rob. So I think we've covered most of the questions. I apologize if I missed anybody. There was a lot of.
We got Edgar here. Edgar's got a hand up.
Oh.
There you go, Edgar. You're ready to unmute.
All right. How about it, Edgar? Edgar, if you unmute, we'll try to grab your question.
You can also click on the right beside their name and say ask to unmute, and they'll get a dialogue. Oh, there you are. Hey, Edgar.
Yeah. I guess this has some relation with the smoke, with roasting defect. I guess it's related to the smoky flavor you get when you miss the cleaning of your airflow. But I think it's also related to some roaster have this valve that they called aroma roast. I think it works by you closing the valve and you kind of get a smoke bath inside the drum, and then you kind of let the smoke stay inside the drum, and then you get this smoky flavor. I tried to do that to replicate that kind of situation, but I don't think I can taste any difference. And then I think it's because of how the net pressure is actually positive inside the bean, and that you are creating some kind of protective layer from the bean, and that the smoke cannot touch the bean. I just want to know what is your general opinion about this and your experience regarding this aroma roast. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. And Edgar, that's a great question. I would agree with your assessment. My theory is the same, that basically the pressure pushing out of the bean is so great that it's difficult for environmental things to really impact it too much. Now, that being said, when you do close it off and the smoke sits there long enough, I think you could potentially produce tars on the outside surface of the seed, which could then cause flavor differences. But yeah, aroma roasting was usually done on very dark roasting too back in the day. So I think that might have something to do with the smoky flavor they were getting. So, and then it looks like we got one last person with their hand up, Dennis, if you want to give them Tom Ray.
Is it John? I'm hoping I got that right.
John.
If you unmute yourself there, we'll try to grab your question.
Okay.
Hey, hello?
Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Can you hear me? Okay, sir. My concern was regarding with scorching, specifically with El Salvador beans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even though I reached my color change and first crack in the decent time, around 5 minutes, and first crack around 4 minutes, 9 minutes, still I have this scorching and a little bit tipping also.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the scorching would be probably related just around heat transfer. So it might be something to do with how your roaster's set up. So that would be kind of one of those things where we'd have to dive in and see like, okay, you know, what's your RPMs? What's your charge temperature? How are you controlling heat? All that sort of thing. So that would be kind of the deep dive we'd have to do on that. If you're getting scorching, even though you're hitting yelling at 5 minutes, it sounds like you just need higher drum speed, and that should help potentially with the issue. So increasing drum speed would be a big help on that one. Tipping would just indicate that you're roasting a little fast for that particular coffee. And so what time are you hitting first crack?
Maybe around 9:12, 9:15, yeah, around like this. But only the Salvador, I have the Ethiopia, Brazil, Nicaragua. They're all looking good, but only the El Salvador beans.
Yeah, so on the Salvador, what I would do is try pushing first crack back closer to 10 minutes and see if that alleviates the issue. If not, it just might be that the El Salvador is a really low density bean, which can still taste great. It just means it's going to give you this problem. And you have to decide, go longer or just say it's okay as it is and kind of run with it. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah,
I appreciate it.